The coffee maker gurgled to life at exactly 6:30 a.m., same as it had every morning for the past 12 years. I stood in our kitchen, my kitchen now. I supposed watching the dark liquid drip into the glass carafe with the kind of detached fascination that comes from having your entire world rearranged overnight. Everything looked the same. The white subway tiles Brian had insisted would be timeless. The granite countertops I'd wanted in a warmer tone but compromised on. The little succulent garden by the window that somehow thrived despite my tendency to either overwater or forget about it entirely. But nothing felt the same. Nothing would ever feel the same again, Mom. Savannah's voice drifted down from upstairs, tentative in that way that told me she'd been lying awake too, processing yesterday's bombshell. Are you making breakfast? I glanced at the clock. 7:15. She'd be late for school if we didn't hurry. But the thought of scrambling eggs and making small talk about her upcoming art project felt impossible. My hands were steady as I poured coffee into 2 mugs, muscle memory taking over where my mind had gone blank. Just coffee this morning, sweetheart. I called back, my voice surprisingly normal. Grab a granola bar. The house felt cavernous. Without Brian's morning routine filling the spaces, no shower running upstairs while he belted out off-key classic rock. No hurried footsteps on the hardwood as he searched for his lucky tie, or the cufflinks I'd given him for his 40th birthday. No kiss goodbye pressed absently to my cheek while he scrolled through emails on his phone. Just silence, and the coffee maker's final wheeze as it finished brewing. Savannah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow looked effortlessly chic the way only 17-year-olds could manage. She had Brian's sharp jawline but my eyes gray-green and too perceptive. For comfort, right now they were studying me with the kind of careful attention that made my chest tighten. You didn't sleep, she said, not a question. I handed her a mug, adding the splash of vanilla creamer she preferred. Neither did you. She accepted the coffee and wrapped her hands around the ceramic, using it as an anchor the same way I was. We stood there in our matching flannel pants and oversized t-shirts. To women who'd woken up in a different life than the one we'd gone to sleep in, is he really not coming back? The question came out smaller than she probably intended. And I saw her straighten immediately, trying to take it back with body language. The honest answer was complicated. Brian had made his intentions clear when he'd sat us both down in the living room yesterday evening, his expression serious in that practiced way he used for difficult board meetings. He was leaving. He'd been thinking about it for months. He'd fallen in love with someone else, someone who understood his vision for the future, who shared his energy and passion for life, someone who made him feel like himself again. Tara Wallace, 26 years old, 150,000 Instagram followers, and a smile that could sell protein powder to vegans. I'd looked her up after he left, torturing myself with her feed full of sunrise yoga sessions and inspirational quotes about living your best life. She was beautiful in that effortless way that came from good genetics and expensive skincare, with the kind of confidence that radiated from never having had to choose between law school dreams and some Ione else's ambitions. But Savannah was asking a different question, really. She was asking if our family, already fragile from years of Brian's increasing absence and my increasing accommodation, was truly broken beyond repair. I don't think so, I said carefully, but that might not be a bad thing. She looked up sharply, and I saw something flicker across her face that might have been relief. I mean, I continued, setting down my mug and really looking at my daughter for the first time in what felt like months. When was the last time the 3 of us had dinner together? Really together, without Dad checking his phone or leaving early for a call with investors. Savannah considered this, her artistic mind working through the implications the way she approached her charcoal sketches carefully, looking for shadows and depth others might miss. Christmas, she said finally. And even then, he spent half of it in the study talking to that guy from Silicon Valley about the new funding round. My heart broke a little more, not for my marriage this time, but for the childhood my daughter had experienced, while I was too busy being grateful for Brian's success to notice how little he was actually present for it. She'd grown up with a father who was physically there but emotionally checked out, and a mother who'd spent so much energy holding everything together that she'd forgotten to ask whether the life we were preserving was worth preserving. Savannah, I reached across the kitchen island and touched her hand. I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and no matter what happens between your father and me, You'll always be the most important thing in my world, she squeezed my fingers, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms. All fierce protectiveness and need for comfort rolled into one small person. What about Aunt Margot? She asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. What about her? You always said she was the most important thing in your world too, before. Savannah trailed off. But I knew what she meant before the fight, before the ultimatum, before I chose Brian's disapproval over Margot's fierce, unconditional love. My sister-in-law, technically my aunt by marriage, though she'd always felt more like family than Brian's actual relatives, had been my closest confidant until 5 years ago. Margot Delaney. With her wild silver hair and her gallery full of paintings that made people stop and stare and feel things they couldn't name. She'd taken one look at Brian when I first brought him home and pronounced him charming as a snake and twice as Slipper. Why, I'd laughed it off then, thinking she just didn't understand his ambition. The fight had started over something stupid: Brian's insistence that Margot's art collection was impractical and that I should encourage her to liquidate some pieces for more sensible investments. It had escalated when Margot offered to loan us money for a house down payment, and Brian's pride couldn't handle accepting help from someone who'd made her fortune doing something he considered frivolous. But the real break had come when Margot asked me point blank why I was shrinking myself to fit into Brian's vision of what a successful man's wife should look like, why I'd given up law school, why I never talked about my own dreams anymore, why I apologized for taking up space in my own life. I'd chosen Brian's wounded ego over her uncomfortable truths, told her she didn't understand what real partnership looked like, said things I couldn't take back about artists living in fantasy worlds while the rest of us dealt with reality. She'd looked at me with such sadness, not anger, just deep, disappointed sadness, and said, "Oh, Natalie, you're going to wake up one day and realize you've been sleepwalking through your own life. I just hope it's not too late when you do." That was the last real conversation we'd had. She'd sent cards for birthdays and holidays, always with little notes about Savannah's artistic talent and how proud she was of both of us. But I'd been too ashamed to reach out, too committed to proving that my choices had been right to admit that maybe, possibly, she'd seen something I'd been too scared to acknowledge. "I miss her," Savannah said quietly, pulling me back to the present. She was the only adult who ever asked me what I wanted to be instead of telling me what I should want to be. My throat tightened. "I know, sweetheart. I miss her too. You could call her. Explain what happened. She'd understand." I nodded, though something cold settled in my stomach at the thought. Margot would understand. But she'd also say she'd seen this coming from a mile away. She'd be kind about it, which would somehow be worse than if she gloated. And she'd ask me the same question she'd asked 5 years ago. "Now what are you going to do about it?" After Savannah left for school, I found myself wandering through the apartment like a ghost haunting her own life. The place was beautiful. Objectively, Brian had excellent taste and the income to indulge it. Everything was curated, purposeful, designed to impress. The kind of home that looked perfect in the architectural magazines we sometimes appeared in when local publications did pieces about Chicago's power couples. I stopped in front of the bookshelf in what we'd always called the study, though it was really Brian's office. My books were there, squeezed into one small section: legal thrillers, a few poetry collections, some historical fiction. Most of them had been wedding gifts, their spines still perfectly straight because I'd rarely had time to read for pleasure. Brian's business books dominated the rest of the space, along with his MBA textbooks and a collection of biographies about successful entrepreneurs. There, wedged behind a copy of Good to Great, was something that made me freeze: a letter, addressed to me in Margot's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, with my name written in the deep purple ink she always used. The postmark was dated 3 months ago. I pulled it out with shaking hands. How had I missed this? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. Brian collected the mail most days, sorting through it in his efficient way and dealing with anything important. He must have stuck this behind the books and forgotten about it, or maybe he hadn't forgotten at all. I tore open the envelope carefully, almost reverent in my handling of what might be the last communication I'd ever receive from the woman who'd loved me better than I'd allowed myself to be loved. The letter was written on Margot's personal stationery, with the watercolor border she designed herself. Her handwriting was as bold and uncompromising as she'd always been. "My dearest Natalie, I'm writing this from my hospital bed, don't panic. It's scheduled surgery. Nothing dramatic, but it's given me time to think about the things I should have said years ago instead of waiting for you to be ready to hear them. I've never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Not when you chose him over me. Not when you stopped returning my calls. Not even when you made it clear that having me in your life was more trouble than it was worth. Love isn't conditional on being convenient. Sweetheart, I learned that lesson. Too late with too many people, but never with you. I know you think I disapproved of Brian because he wasn't artistic or because he didn't understand my world. That was never it. I disapproved of what you became when you were trying to be what he needed instead of who you are. I watched you fold yourself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into a space that was never designed to hold all of you. It broke my heart. But here's what I want you to know. It's never too late to unfold again. It's never too late to remember that you are not a supporting character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own life, and you get to decide how it ends. The law offices of Chen Martinez and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in the Loop, the kind of building that made you feel small and significant at the same time. I stood in the marble lobby, clutching Margot's letter in my purse like a talisman, and wondered if I looked as lost as I felt. 3 days had passed since Brian's announcement. 3 days of moving through my life like I was underwater, and I still felt like I might float away if I didn't hold onto something solid. Miss Quinn, a man in his mid-40s, approached, extending his hand with the kind of measured warmth that came from years of delivering both good news and devastating news to people in their most vulnerable moment. David Chen, thank you for coming in. His handshake was firm but not overwhelming, and his eyes held the kind of genuine kindness that made something tight in my chest loosen just slightly. He led me through a hallway lined with abstract art, the kind Margot would have had opinions about, probably unflattering ones, to a corner office that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Please sit wherever you're comfortable, he said, gesturing to a seating area with 2 leather chairs separated by a small table. Can I get you coffee, water? Coffee would be wonderful. I settled into one of the chairs, noting how it seemed to embrace me rather than merely support me. Everything about this place spoke to attention to detail, to caring about the human experience of difficult moments. He returned with 2 steaming mugs and a plate of what looked like homemade cookies, my wife's recipe, he explained, catching my questioning look. She insists that legal meetings go better with something sweet. I've learned not to argue with her wisdom. I accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping my hands around the ceramic for warmth. Mr. Chen, I have to admit I'm not entirely sure why I'm here. Margot's letter mentioned a bequest. But we hadn't spoken in years. His expression grew gentle. Ms. Delaney was very clear about that. She said you might be surprised, might even feel like you didn't deserve whatever she was leaving you. She wanted me to start by telling you that love doesn't have expiration dates, and neither does family. The words hit me like a physical touch, and I had to set down my coffee mug before my trembling hands betrayed how deeply they affected me. She also wanted me to give you this before we discussed the legal aspects. He handed me a small, wrapped package. She said it would help you understand. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before, Margot and me at some family gathering. Probably 10 years ago. I was laughing at something she'd said, my head thrown back with genuine joy, and she was looking at me with such profound affection that it made my throat close up. On the back, in her distinctive purple ink, she'd written, "This is who you are. When you let yourself be seen, never forget. She loved you very much," David said quietly, "and she was extremely proud of you, despite what you might think. But I chose Brian over her. I said terrible things. She knew why you made the choices you did. She understood that love sometimes means protecting the people we care about from truths they're not." Ray, did you hear? He leaned forward slightly. Miss Delaney was a remarkable woman, but she was also honest about her own mistakes. She told me once that she'd learned too late that being right isn't always the same as being helpful. I traced the edge of the photograph with my finger, remembering. That day, it had been some cousin's wedding, and Margot had been telling me about a new artist she'd discovered, someone who painted everyday objects with such careful attention that they became profound. I'd been genuinely interested then before I'd learned to filter my enthusiasms through Brian's practical lens. What did she leave me? I asked, finally ready to hear the answer. David opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. The short version is that Margot Delaney died with a net worth of approximately $5.2 million. You are her sole heir. The number hit me like a slap. I'd known Margot was comfortable, her gallery, her art collection, her beautiful Lincoln Park townhouse, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. $5 million, I repeated. Sure, I'd misheard. 5.2, to be precise. She was incredibly savvy about investments, particularly in emerging artists. Several pieces she bought for thousands in the 80s and 90s are now worth hundreds of thousands each. She also had a diversified portfolio of more traditional investments. He paused, studying my face. You look like you might need a moment. I was too stunned to speak. This morning I'd been Natalie Quinn, soon-to-be divorced paralegal whose biggest financial worry was whether I'd be able to afford my own apartment after the divorce settlement. Now I was, what, a millionaire. It didn't feel real. There's more, David continued gently. Margot was very specific about how she wanted this handled. She's left you a series of letters to be given to you over time, and the inheritance comes with what she called loving suggestions. What kind of suggestions? He pulled out another envelope. This one sealed with wax in the deep purple color Margot had always favored. She wanted you to read this yourself, but she summarized it for me as well. The first $500,000 is to be spent entirely on yourself, your education, your dreams, your future. She was adamant about this, not on practical things like bills or housing, not on other people, not on investments, on you. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. My darling Natalie, if you're reading this, then David has delivered the news and you're probably sitting in his office wondering if this is some elaborate joke. It's not. The money is real. And it's yours, and you deserve every penny of it, but here's the thing about deserving. You're going to have to prove it to yourself. For the next year, I want you to be selfish, gloriously, unapologetically selfish. Take that money and spend it on the woman you used to be, the one who wanted to change the world through law, who collected art books and dreamed of traveling to see the originals, who believed she could be anything. I know you're thinking you should be practical. You're thinking about Savannah's college fund and retirement planning and all the sensible things Brian taught you to prioritize. But darling, you've been practical your entire adult life, and where has it gotten you? Has it made you happy? Has it made you feel alive? The rest of the money will be there when you're ready for it. But this first piece is medicine for a soul that's been starving for too long. Take a class, travel somewhere that calls to you, buy art that makes you feel something, learn something new. Remember what it feels like to want something just because it brings you joy. I've also left you my contacts in the art world, my financial advisor's information, and detailed notes about each piece in my collection. Some of them are gifts for you to keep. Some are investments you might consider selling. And some are meant to be shared with Savannah when she's ready. But most importantly, I've left you permission to disappoint people, to make choices that others might not understand, to take up space and make noise and refuse to apologize for having needs and wants and dreams. The scared small voice in your head that's saying you can't accept this, that you don't deserve this, that it's too much. That's not your voice, darling. That's the voice of everyone who benefited from your smallness. Tell it to be quiet. You have work to do. All my love and faith in you, Margot. There's one more thing. I've left you my townhouse as well, not because I think you need it, but because I want you to have a space that was never shaped by anyone else's vision of who you should be. It's yours to keep, sell, or burn down, whatever feels right for the woman you're becoming. I read the letter twice before looking up at David, who was watching me with patient understanding. The townhouse too, I managed, fully paid off, no liens. She left detailed instructions about the transition, including the recommendation that you not make any major decisions about it for at least 6 months. He pulled out another set of documents. She also set up a trust for Savannah's education and future needs, separate from your inheritance. She wanted to make sure you knew that choosing to spend money on yourself wouldn't impact your daughter's security. The weight of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was choice, it was the opportunity to answer the question that had been haunting me since Brian left. Who was I when I wasn't trying to be what someone else needed? There's one more thing, David said, and something in his tone made me look up sharply. She left video messages, short ones, meant to be watched when you reach certain milestones. The first one is to be viewed after you've spent the initial $500,000. Video messages, she made them during her final weeks. She said she wanted to be able to celebrate your journey with you. Even if she couldn't be there in person, he handed me a small envelope. This contains information about accessing them, along with contact details for her financial advisor, Jonathan Lin. She spoke very highly of him. I stared at the envelope, thinking about Margot planning all of this while she was dying, thinking about me and my future when I'd been too proud and too scared to think about her. Mr. Chen, I said finally, I need to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think she was right about me? I mean, about all of this. He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. I met with Margot many times over the last year as we prepared these documents. She talked about you constantly, not just about who you used to be, but about who she saw you becoming. She said you were like a seed that had been planted too deep in soil that wasn't right for you, but that you were still alive down there, still growing, just waiting for the right conditions. He paused, then continued. She also said that the hardest part wouldn't be accepting the money, it would be accepting that you deserve to make choices based on what you want, not what others need from you. I thought about Brian, about how he'd looked at me when he announced he was leaving, not with malice, but with a kind of dismissive certainty that I would handle it gracefully, that I would make it easy for him because that's what I always did. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my own wants and needs to avoid conflict, to keep the peace, to be the kind of woman who didn't cause problems. She was right about one thing, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I have been practical my entire adult life, and you're right to ask where it's gotten me. David smiled. So what happens now? I looked down at the inheritance documents, at the photograph of myself laughing, at Margaret's letter with its challenge to be gloriously selfish. For the first time in 3 days, I felt something other than numbness or grief. I felt possibility. Now I figure out what I want, I said, and then I go get it. We spent another hour going through the practical details: account transfers, tax implications, the process for taking possession of the townhouse. David gave me a business card for Jonathan Lin and suggested I meet with him within the week to discuss long-term financial planning. One more thing, he said as I prepared to leave. Margot left instructions that no one else should know about this inheritance unless you choose to tell them. She was very specific about that. She said you'd know when and how to share the information. I thought about Brian, about his wounded pride and his financial struggles with the startup, about Savannah, who deserved to know that her future was secure but who also needed to see her mother modeling independence and self-worth, about my own tendency to manage everyone else's feelings about my choices. She really did know me. Well, I said, she loved you well. David corrected gently. There's a difference. Walking out of the building into the bright October afternoon, I felt like I was seeing Chicago with new eyes. The same streets, the same buildings, the same lake in the distance, but I was different now. I had choices, I had freedom, I had the terrifying, exhilarating opportunity to disappoint people. My phone buzzed with a text from Camila. How are you holding up? Want to grab dinner and wine and talk about what a jackass Brian is? Instead of my usual response, something about being fine, not wanting to burden her. Maybe another time, I typed back, yes, but I have news, big news. Can we make it somewhere nice? My treat. Her response was immediate. Did you win the lottery? I looked up at the glass tower, where I'd just learned I was worth more than $5 million. Where I'd been given permission to be selfish and space to grow and the financial freedom to choose my own path forward, something like that. I texted back, I'll explain everything. As I walked toward the train station, I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my browser and searched for information about law schools in Chicago, not because I was ready to apply, not because I had a plan, but because for the first time in decades, I was allowed to wonder what might be possible. The seed that Margot had talked about, the one that had been planted too deep in the wrong soil, was finally ready to see what happened when it was given room to grow. The wine had helped. After 3 glasses of an excellent Cabernet that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week, I'd managed to tell Camila everything: Brian's betrayal, Margaret's death, the inheritance that had turned my world upside down in the span of a single afternoon. She'd listened with the kind of fierce attention that reminded me why we'd become friends in the first place. Back when we were both young paralegals working late nights and dreaming of better futures. $5 million, she repeated now, leaning back in the booth at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, where I'd insisted we eat despite her protests that it was too expensive. $5 million. 5.2, I corrected, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, plus the townhouse. Camila shook her head slowly, her dark eyes bright with something between amazement and fierce pride. Natalie, do you understand what this means? You're free. You're actually completely free. The word hung between us, as intoxicating and terrifying as the wine. Free. When was the last time I'd felt free? When was the last time I'd made a decision based entirely on what I wanted, rather than what was expected or needed or practical? I don't even know what that looks like, I admitted. I've been making decisions based on other people's needs for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to want things for myself. Then we figure it out, Camila said firmly, starting tomorrow. What did the lawyers say about the money? Any restrictions? I pulled out Margaret's letter, which I'd been carrying with me like a talisman. She wants me to spend the first $500,000 on myself, not on bills or practical things or other people, on me. Jesus, Natalie, even dead, your aunt is giving better advice than most living people. Camila raised her glass to Margot Delaney. Foreseeing what the rest of us were too polite to say, we drank to that, and I felt something warm and dangerous unfurling in my chest, the feeling of being understood, of being seen not as I'd trained myself to be, but as I actually was. There's something else, I said, pulling out the business card David Chen had given me. I have a meeting tomorrow with a financial advisor, Jonathan Lin. Margot recommended him specifically. Smart. You'll want to protect this from Brian before he finds out. Camilla's expression grew serious, because he will find out, eventually, and when he does, she didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew Brian well enough to know that his wounded pride would quickly transform into wounded greed. Once he learned about the inheritance, he'd find ways to claim it was marital property, or that he deserved compensation for all the years he'd supported my career, or that Savannah's needs should take priority over my sudden windfall. David Chen said Margot was very specific about keeping this private until I'm ready to share it. Margot was a smart woman. Give yourself time to build some walls before Brian comes knocking. Camila signaled for another bottle of wine, then caught my expression. What? I keep thinking about what she wrote in the letter, about being selfish, about taking up space. I traced the rim of my wine glass with one finger. I don't think I've ever been selfish in my entire life. I'm not even sure I know how. Oh honey, Camilla's voice was soft with understanding. Being selfish isn't about hurting other people. It's about remembering that your needs matter too, that your dreams are worth pursuing, that you deserve to be happy. She was right. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it in my bones were two different things. I'd spent so many years being the practical one, the accommodating one, the one who made everyone else's life easier, that the idea of prioritizing my own wants felt almost revolutionary. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from Brian. Can we talk? There are things we need to discuss about Savannah and the logistics of separating our lives. I stared at the message, feeling the familiar tug of obligation. The old Natalie would have responded immediately, would have suggested we meet at his convenience, would have prepared herself to make this process as painless as possible for him. Instead, I turned the phone face down and reached for my wine. Good girl, Camila said, having watched the entire interaction. He can wait, you've got more important things to think about. The next morning, I stood outside the offices of Lin Financial Management in the West Loop, trying to calm the nerves that had been building since I'd woken up. The weight of everything, the inheritance, the decisions I needed to make, the future I was suddenly free to choose, felt enormous in the bright October sunlight. Jonathan Lin's office was on the 32nd floor of a sleek building that spoke to success without being ostentatious. The elevator ride gave me time to study my reflection in the polished steel doors. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a navy suit that was professional but not submissive, the kind of thing that said I was someone worth taking seriously. It was a small thing, but it felt like armor. The reception area was warm and welcoming, with contemporary art on the walls and furniture that managed to be both comfortable and sophisticated. A young woman at the front desk greeted me with genuine warmth and offered me coffee or tea while I waited. Miss Quinn, a man appeared from a hallway, extending his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. Jonathan Lin, It's a pleasure to meet you, though I'm sorry for the circumstances. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm presence that immediately put me at ease. He led me to his office, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River and walls lined with books that looked like they'd actually been read. "Margot spoke of you often," he said as we settled into chairs arranged around a small conference table. "She was very fond of you, and very proud. She also said you might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this." "That's an understatement," I admitted. "Mr. Lin, I have to be honest, I've never dealt with anything like this before. My financial planning experience extends to balancing a checkbook and contributing to a 401k. Please, call me Jonathan. And that's perfectly normal. Most people don't expect to inherit millions of dollars." His smile was reassuring. "That's why I'm here. Margot and I worked together for almost 15 years, and I helped her build the portfolio that she's now left to you. I understand her philosophy about money and what she hoped you'd accomplish with it." He pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal charts and documents that looked like they belonged in a different world than the one I'd been living in. "Let's start with the basics," he said. "The inheritance consists of several components: cash and traditional investments totaling about $2.8 million. Her art collection valued at approximately $1.9 million. The Lincoln Park townhouse worth about $800,000, and some additional assets bringing the total to just over $5.2 million. The numbers still felt surreal, like we were discussing someone else's life. Margot was very specific about how she wanted this structured. Jonathan continued. "She's already established a trust that will provide for Savannah's education and future needs, separate from your inheritance, and she's created what she called guardrails to protect you from both external pressure and your own tendency toward excessive practicality." Despite everything, I found myself smiling at that. She really did know me. She did, which is why the first thing we're going to do is set up a separate LLC to hold the majority of your assets. This will protect them from any claims in your divorce proceedings and give you complete control over how the money is managed and distributed. Over the next hour, Jonathan walked me through the practical steps of protecting my new fortune. Shell companies with innocuous names, trust structures that would keep the money legally separate from anything Brian could claim, investment strategies that would ensure the money continued to grow while giving me access to funds for Margot's loving suggestions. "There's one more thing," he said as we neared the end of our meeting. "Margot left specific instructions about a property downtown. She's been the silent owner of a gallery space in River North for the past 3 years. She bought it with the intention of gifting it to you when you were ready." I stared at him. "A gallery?" "The Meridian Gallery, on Wells Street. It's been operating under a management company." "But the deed is now in your name." He pulled out a set of keys and a manila envelope. "She said you'd know what to do with it when the time was right." The keys felt warm in my palm, solid and real in a way that the bank statements and legal documents hadn't. A gallery, a space for art, for creativity, for the things that had once mattered to me before I'd learned to prioritize other people's definitions of success. "Jonathan," I said slowly, "I need to ask you something. Do you think Margot was right about all this, about me being capable of whatever it is she thought I could become?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "I think Margot saw something in you that you haven't seen in yourself yet. But I also think she was betting on something that was already there, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge." He handed me a business card and a small wrapped package. "She asked me to give you this when we finished the legal arrangements. She said it would help you remember what you're working toward." Inside the package was a small piece of sea glass, smooth and green and perfect, mounted on a simple silver chain. There was a note attached in Margot's handwriting. "Found this on the beach in Maine, where you said you wanted to go someday. It started as something sharp and broken, but the ocean made it beautiful. Wear it when you need to remember that transformation is possible." I fastened the necklace around my neck, feeling the cool glass settle against my collarbone like a promise. That evening, I stood outside the Meridian Gallery with Savannah, both of us staring up at the sleek storefront with its large windows and elegant signage. The space was dark now, but I could see enough to know that it was beautiful, the kind of place that invited people to slow down and really look at things. "Aunt Margot owned this?" Savannah asked, her voice full of wonder. "Apparently, and now I do." The keys felt strange in my hand, like I was holding someone else's life. Do you want to see inside? The gallery was larger than it had appeared. From the street, with soaring ceilings and expertly placed lighting that made the empty walls seem full of possibility, our footsteps echoed in the quiet space as we explored. Both of us moving with the kind of reverence that art spaces commanded. Mom, Savannah said suddenly, stopping in front of a wall where a single painting hung, the only piece that had been left behind. Look, it was the painting Margot had mentioned in her letter. The one she'd left specifically for Savannah, a woman walking away from a burning house. Her back straight and her step confident, while behind her the flames illuminated everything she was leaving behind. It was beautiful and terrible and hopeful all at once. She knew, Savannah said softly, she knew this would happen, didn't she, with Dad? I studied my daughter's face, seeing something there that I'd been too caught up in my own turmoil to notice before. She wasn't devastated by Brian's departure, she was relieved. I think she knew I needed to remember who I was before I became who everyone else needed me to be, I said finally. Savannah nodded. Still looking at the painting, I've been thinking about what you said the other morning, about Dad not really being present even when he was here. And I realized something. What's that? I don't really miss him. I miss the idea of him like the dad I thought I was supposed to have. But the actual person? The one who was always on his phone during dinner and forgot my art shows and made you apologize for taking up space. She shook her head. I don't miss that at all. The honesty in her voice broke something open in my chest. All this time I'd been worried about how Brian's abandonment would affect her. But she'd been watching and learning and drawing her own conclusions about what love was supposed to look like. Savannah, I said carefully, there's something I need to tell you about Aunt Margot and about some changes that are coming. I told her everything then about the inheritance, about the freedom it represented, about the choices I was finally able to make. I watched her face as I explained, saw the moment when understanding dawned and was replaced by something that looked like fierce pride. So what happens now? She asked when I finished. I looked around the gallery, at the empty walls waiting to be filled with art that mattered, at the space Margot had left me to grow into, at my daughter who was old enough to understand that sometimes the best thing a mother could do was model what it looked like to choose herself. Now I figure out what I want, I said. And then I do something I haven't done in years. What's that? I stop apologizing for it. My phone buzzed, then another text from Brian, more insistent this time. Natalie, we really need to talk. I'm coming by the apartment tomorrow evening. There are important things to discuss. I stared at the message, feeling the familiar tug of old patterns, the automatic impulse to accommodate, to make things easier for him, to manage his feelings about my choices. Instead, I deleted the message without responding. Good, Savannah said, having watched the whole thing. Let him wait, we've got more important things to think about. She was right. We did have more important things to think about, like what kind of art belonged on these walls, like what it meant to build a life around joy instead of obligation, like what it felt like to take up space without apologizing for it. As we locked up the gallery and walked toward the train station, I caught sight of our reflection in a storefront, window, two women walking side by side, both of us looking stronger and more purposeful than we had just a week ago. Behind us, the lights of the city created a backdrop of possibility, and ahead of us stretched a future that was finally, completely ours to choose. Brian could wait. For the first time in our marriage, my needs were going to come first. Brian had chosen Intelligentsia Coffee on Broadway, the kind of trendy spot where startup founders held meetings and influencers took photos of their oat milk lattes. It was typical of him, somewhere public enough to prevent any dramatic scenes, hip enough to match his carefully curated image, expensive enough to remind anyone within earshot that he was successful. As I walked through the door 15 minutes after our agreed-upon time, I realized he'd probably chosen it because he assumed I'd never been there before, that it would put me slightly off balance in a space that belonged more to his world than mine. He was wrong on multiple counts. I discovered Intelligentsia 3 days ago, when I'd spent an entire afternoon wandering through neighborhoods I'd never had time to explore. Armed with Margot's directive to spend money on myself and a growing sense that Chicago was full of places I'd never allowed myself to discover, I'd sat in this same cafe for 2 hours, drinking excellent coffee and reading through the pile of art books I'd bought at Powell's, feeling like a tourist in my own city. Brian was already seated at a small table near the window, checking his phone with the kind of focused intensity that had once made me feel like I was interrupting whenever I tried to talk to him. He looked up as I approached, and I caught the flash of surprise that crossed his face when he took in my appearance. I'd dressed carefully for this meeting, not the way I used to dress for Brian, trying to anticipate what would please him or at least not displease him, but the way I'd started dressing for myself. A burgundy sweater that brought out the green in my eyes, well-fitted jeans that made me feel confident, and the sea glass necklace from Margot that had become my talisman. I looked like someone who had places to be and things to do, someone whose time was valuable. "You look," he started, then seemed to recalibrate. "Different, good, you look good, thank you." I settled into the chair across from him, noting how he immediately launched into his prepared speech, without offering to buy me coffee or asking how I was doing. Some things, apparently, never changed. "Natalie, I want you to know how grateful I am that you agreed to meet. I know this whole situation has been difficult, and I appreciate how gracefully you've been handling everything." The phrase hit me like a small slap, gracefully, as if my response to his abandonment was a performance he was reviewing, rating my composure and finding it satisfactory. As if the most important thing about my husband leaving me for a younger woman was how well I managed his comfort level with the transition. "Brian," I said, surprising us both with the steadiness in my voice, "what did you want to discuss?" He blinked, clearly having expected more of the usual dance, my questions about his feelings, my reassurances that I understood his position, my management of the emotional logistics that would make this easier for him, right? Of course. He straightened, shifting into what I recognized as his boardroom mode. "There are practical matters we need to address. The apartment, obviously, Savannah's schedule and financial needs, the division of assets." I nodded, pulling out the leather portfolio I'd bought yesterday, another small act of selfishness that had made me feel more professional, more serious. "I've been thinking about that too." Good, good. I was hoping we could keep this simple, amicable." He leaned forward slightly, and I caught a whiff of the cologne I'd given him last Christmas, the one he'd said was too expensive and impractical. Apparently, some expenses were more justified than others. "I know you're probably worried about finances, and I want to assure you that I'll be fair about support payments." The condescension in his tone was so familiar I almost missed it. Almost. A week ago, I would have been grateful for his reassurance, relieved that he was thinking about my financial security. Now, with Jonathan Lynn's business card in my wallet and Margot's inheritance safely protected in accounts Brian knew nothing about, his magnanimous offer to be fair struck me as both insulting and irrelevant. "That's generous of you," I said carefully, "but I'm not particularly worried about finances." Another flash of surprise quickly covered, "Well, that's great, Natalie. I'm glad you're feeling confident about the future." There was a question buried in his statement, a fishing expedition disguised as casual conversation. Brian was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He'd built his career on reading people, on identifying opportunities and threats, on gathering information that could be useful later. The fact that I wasn't behaving like a woman facing financial uncertainty was clearly registering as something worth investigating. I said simply, very confident." He waited for me to elaborate, to explain where this newfound confidence was coming from. When I didn't, he shifted tactics. "How's Savannah handling everything? I know this has been hard on her." "She's resilient," I said, thinking about my daughter's relief when she'd admitted she didn't really miss Brian's presence. "Stronger than either of us gave her credit for. I think she's a good kid." We did something right there. The casual inclusion of himself in Savannah's strength, as if he'd been equally present in raising her, would have passed without comment a week ago. Now it grated. "Yes, we did." I didn't correct the pronoun, but I didn't endorse it either. Brian's phone buzzed on the table, and his eyes flickered toward it automatically before he caught himself. "Sorry, work has been." He trailed off, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something that looked like genuine stress cross his face. "How is work?" I asked, remembering what he'd accidentally revealed during his original announcement, something about investors and funding rounds and the pressures that had been building. "Challenging," he said carefully. "The market is tough right now, lots of volatility, lots of uncertainty." It was the most honest thing he'd said since I'd arrived, and it confirmed what I'd suspected. Brian's decision to leave hadn't happened in a vacuum. His company was struggling, his carefully constructed success story was showing cracks. And Tara Wallace represented more than just a younger woman, she represented a version of himself that didn't have to deal with the complexities and compromises of real life. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said. "You always do." He looked at me sharply, as if trying to determine whether there was sarcasm hidden in my supportive words. When he couldn't find any, his expression grew even more puzzled. "Natalie," he said slowly, "are you seeing someone, a therapist, I mean? Because you seem different, calmer than I expected." The question was revealing in its assumptions that my calmness must be artificial, managed. The result of professional intervention rather than genuine change, that a woman whose husband had just left her for someone 15 years younger should be falling apart, should be desperate and clinging and eager to prove her worth. "I'm seeing several new people, actually," I said truthfully. "It's been enlightening. Jonathan Lin, David Chen, the gallery manager who'd shown me around the Meridian yesterday, the woman at the art supply store who'd helped me pick out sketchbooks and charcoals, reigniting a passion I'd abandoned decades ago. All the people who were helping me build a life that had nothing to do with being Brian Quinn's wife. That's," he seemed to struggle with how to respond, "that's great. I want you to be happy. Natalie, I hope you know that." The sincerity in his voice was almost worse than the condescension had been. He genuinely believed that his happiness required my unhappiness, that for him to move forward, I needed to be left behind. The idea that I might not only survive but thrive without him was clearly outside the realm of his imagination. "I do know that," I said, "and I want the same for you." His phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, and I watched him more with the impulse to check it. Finally, he gave in, glancing at the screen with the kind of urgency that suggested crisis management. "I'm sorry," he said, already half standing. "I need to take this, it's investors. And we're in the middle of some delicate negotiations." "Of course," I said, "go ahead." He stepped outside to take the call, and I watched through the window as his conversation grew increasingly animated. His free hand moved in sharp gestures, his posture grew more defensive, and his expression shifted from confident charm to barely controlled panic. Whatever was happening with his company, it was serious enough to interrupt our first face-to-face conversation since he'd blown up our marriage. When he returned 10 minutes later, the composed facade had cracked slightly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just some routine stuff that needed immediate attention." It was clearly not routine, and it clearly was not fine. But I didn't push. The old Natalie would have offered comfort, would have asked probing questions designed to give him space to vent his frustrations. The new Natalie was learning that other people's problems weren't automatically her responsibility to solve. "Brian," I said, "was there something specific you needed to discuss? Because I have other plans this afternoon." The lie came easily, and it felt like a small victory. I did have plans. I was going to visit Margit's townhouse for the first time, to walk through the space that was now mine and start imagining what my life might look like there. But more than that, I was asserting that my time had value, that this conversation was happening at my convenience as much as his. "Right, yes," he gathered himself, returning to the agenda he'd clearly prepared. "I wanted to talk about the apartment, obviously. One of us will need to move out, and I thought it made sense for you to stay there with Savannah. I can find something temporary while we work out the permanent arrangements." It was a reasonable offer, generous even. The apartment was beautiful, familiar, perfectly located for Savannah's school and my job. 6 months ago, I would have been grateful for his consideration, relieved that he wasn't going to disrupt Savannah's stability along with everything else. But 6 months ago, I hadn't inherited a townhouse in Lincoln Park that came with no memories of compromise, no echoes of arguments about practical versus beautiful, no history of making myself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of what a life should look like. "Actually," I said, "I think Savannah and I will be moving out." His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Moving out, where?" "I found a place that I think will be better for both of us. More space for Savannah's art, a neighborhood with more character." "All true, though not the whole truth. You can keep the apartment if you want it." The confusion on his face was almost comical. This conversation wasn't going according to any script he'd prepared. He'd expected me to be grateful, accommodating, perhaps a little sad but ultimately manageable. Instead, I was making independent decisions about my future. Decisions that didn't require his input or approval. "Natalie," He said slowly, "How are you planning to afford a new place? I mean, I know you're working, but the market in Chicago is." There it was. The real question he'd been building toward. How was I managing financially? Where was this unexpected confidence coming from? What resources did I have that he didn't know about? "I'm managing fine." I said, "Better than I expected, actually. But surely you'll need help with the deposit, the moving expenses." "No," I said firmly, "I won't." We stared at each other across the small table. And I could see him trying to solve the puzzle of my transformation. Independent Natalie, confident Natalie who didn't seem to need his help or approval or financial support. This wasn't the woman he'd left behind when he'd walked out with his suitcase and his wounded pride. His phone buzzed again, and this time he ignored it. But I could see the effort it cost him. "Natalie," he said, leaning forward with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for potential investors. "I have to ask, is there something you're not telling me, because you seem, I don't know how to describe it, like you've got some kind of secret?" The accuracy of his observation was startling. I did have secrets. I had Margot's inheritance, safely protected in accounts he couldn't touch. I had the gallery, with its promise of creative fulfillment and financial independence. I had a future that I was choosing for myself, piece by piece, without reference to what he needed or wanted or expected from me. But more than that, I had the secret of my own worth. The secret that I deserved to be happy, that my dreams mattered, that I didn't have to apologize for taking up space in my own life. It was the most dangerous secret of all, because once a woman learned it, she became impossible to control. "Everyone has secrets, Brian," I said, standing and gathering my things. "I'm just learning that some of them are worth keeping." I left him sitting there with his cooling coffee and his buzzing phone, his carefully planned conversation derailed by a woman who was no longer interested in making his life easier at the expense of her own. As I walked down Broadway toward the train station, I felt the weight of his confusion following me like a shadow. Brian Quinn, who'd built his career on reading people and situations, who prided himself on his ability to anticipate and control outcomes, had just discovered that the woman he'd dismissed as predictable and manageable was becoming someone he didn't recognize. It was, I realized with a satisfaction that surprised me in its intensity, exactly what Margot had hoped for when she'd left me the tools to transform my life. Not revenge, but something far more powerful. The simple, radical act of becoming unavailable for the role I'd been playing for so long. My phone buzzed as I descended into the subway station, a text from Camila asking how the meeting had gone. Instead of my usual detailed analysis of every word and gesture, I simply typed back, "He has no idea what's coming, because he didn't, none of them did." And for the first time in my adult life, that felt like an advantage I was finally ready to use. The smell hit me first when I unlocked the door to Margot's townhouse, lavender and linseed oil, old books and the faint trace of expensive perfume that lingered like a ghost in the afternoon light. I stood in the entryway, key still in my hand, feeling like an intruder in someone else's sanctuary, even though the deed in my purse said this place belonged to me now. Camila whistled low behind me. "Jesus, Natalie, this is gorgeous." She was right. The townhouse was everything I'd remembered from childhood visits, and more: high ceilings with original crown molding, hardwood floors that gleamed like honey, windows that filled the space with golden light. But it was also unmistakably Margot's, filled with the accumulated treasures of a life lived without apology. Paintings covered nearly every wall, some I recognized from her gallery days and others that must have been recent acquisitions. Books spilled from built-in shelves, and sculptures occupied corners with the casual confidence of old friends. "She lived here alone?" Camila asked, running her fingers along the back of a velvet sofa that probably cost more than my annual salary. "For 30 years, I said, moving deeper into the space. "She always said she'd rather be alone than lonely with someone else." It was a philosophy that had puzzled me when I was younger, when I still believed that partnership meant completion, rather than collaboration. Now, walking through rooms that breathed with one woman's uncompromising vision, I was beginning to understand what she'd meant. The kitchen was a revelation, not the sterile, magazine-perfect space Brian had insisted on in our apartment, but a working artist's kitchen with copper pots hanging from hooks, herbs growing on the windowsill, and a table covered with books about color theory and Renaissance painters. I could picture Margot here, making her famous Sunday morning pancakes while holding forth about the revolutionary potential of abstract expressionism. Mom. Savannah's voice was soft with wonder from the living room. Come look at this, I found her standing in front of a wall that I'd somehow missed on my first pass through the room. It was covered with photographs, not the carefully curated family portraits that decorated most people's homes, but candid shots that captured moments of genuine joy and connection. There was Margot at gallery openings, surrounded by artists and collectors, her silver hair wild and her eyes bright with possibility. Margot traveling on beaches in Greece, in gardens in France, at museums in New York where she stood next to paintings like she was greeting old friends, and scattered throughout were pictures of me as a child, painting at an easel in what must have been Margot's first studio, me in college, laughing at some joke I couldn't remember at what looked like a family barbecue, me at my wedding, looking young and hopeful and completely unaware of how much I would change in the years that followed. But the photo that stopped me cold was one I'd never seen before, me at maybe 10 years old, covered in paint and grinning like I'd discovered the secret to happiness. I was holding up a canvas that showed a tree in brilliant, impossible colors, and Margot was crouched beside me, her expression full of pride and delight. You painted that, Savannah said, studying my face. You were really good. I'd forgotten. Somehow, in all the years of being practical and responsible and focused on other people's dreams, I'd forgotten that I used to love creating things, that I used to believe art mattered, that beauty was worth pursuing, that the world needed more color and less gray. She kept everything, I whispered, noticing other pieces of childhood artwork framed and displayed with the same care Margot showed her expensive acquisitions. All these years, she kept everything. Camila appeared behind us, carrying a bottle of wine she'd apparently found in the kitchen. This woman understood something about love that most people never figure out, she said, studying the photo wall. She loved you not for who you became, but for who you always were. The truth of that observation hit me like a physical blow. Margot had seen something in me that I'd lost sight of somewhere along the way, the woman who believed in beauty, who made things with her hands, who took up space without apologizing for it. She'd been waiting for that woman to come back, even when I'd convinced myself she was gone forever. There's something else you need to see, Savannah said, pulling me toward what had once been the formal dining room. Look, Margot had transformed the space into a studio, easels and canvases, paints organized by color in a way that spoke to decades of practice, brushes standing at attention in glass jars. But what took my breath away was the painting in progress on the central easel, a landscape that seemed to glow with inner light. She was still working, I said, touching the edge of the canvas where the paint was still slightly tacky. Even at the end, she was still creating. There was a note taped to the easel in Margot's distinctive handwriting. For Natalie, finish this when you're ready to remember who you are. I stared at the unfinished painting, seeing the way she'd built up layers of color to create depth and movement, the way she'd left space for something that wasn't quite visible yet. It was beautiful and incomplete, like a question waiting for an answer. Mom, Savannah said quietly, I think we should reopen the gallery. I turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that reminded me of Margot, that same fierce conviction that art mattered, that beauty was worth fighting for. What do you mean? The Meridian Gallery. We could make it something special, not just another space for rich people to buy expensive art, but a place that actually means something. Her words came faster as the idea took shape. We could showcase emerging artists, offer classes for kids who can't afford art lessons, create scholarships for students like me who want to study art but whose parents think it's impractical. As she spoke, I could see it, not just the gallery as it was, but as it could become, a space that honored Margot's memory while creating something new. Something that served the community rather than just the elite collectors who usually populated art openings. Savannah, that's a beautiful idea, but it would be expensive, complicated. I don't know anything about running a gallery. You don't have to know everything, Camila interrupted. You just have to be willing to learn, and you don't have to do it alone. She was right. But the practical voice in my head, the one that had been honed by years of being Brian's wife, immediately started cataloging the obstacles, the permits and insurance, the staff and marketing, the 1,000 details that could go wrong when idealism met reality. But there was another voice too, quieter but growing stronger. The voice that remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond managing other people's needs. The voice that had been silenced for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. We'd need help, I said slowly, people who actually know how to run an arts organization, so we find them. Savannah said with the confidence of 17 years old. Aunt Margot had connections all over the city. Her address book is probably worth more than most people's retirement funds. I thought about the inheritance sitting in my protected accounts, about Margaret's directive to spend money on myself, on my dreams, on the things that would help me remember who I was before I learned to apologize for taking up space. It would be a huge commitment, I said. Time, money, energy, and your father. I trailed off, realizing that Brian's opinion about my choices was no longer automatically relevant to my decision-making process. What about Dad? Savannah asked. Nothing, I said, surprised by how liberating it felt to dismiss his potential objections before they'd even been voiced. You're right. We should do it. Over the next few hours, we wandered through Margaret's house like archaeologists discovering a lost civilization. Every room held treasures, not just valuable objects, but pieces of a life lived with intention and passion. In her bedroom, we found the journals she'd kept for decades, filled with thoughts about art and politics and the small moments that made life worth living. In her study, we discovered correspondence with artists I'd only read about, people who'd trusted her judgment and valued her friendship. And everywhere, there were traces of the woman I used to be. Sketches I'd made as a teenager, carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper, cards I'd sent her from college, where I'd written about art history classes and museum visits with the kind of enthusiasm I'd forgotten I was capable of. Evidence of a relationship I'd thrown away in my determination to prove that I'd chosen the right path. She never gave up on you, Camila observed, reading over my shoulder as I flipped through a journal entry from just 2 years ago. Margot had written about a painting that reminded her of my childhood work, wondering if I still had any interest in creating things or if marriage had completely extinguished that part of me. I gave up on myself, I said, but she didn't. We were sitting in Margaret's studio as the afternoon light began to fade, drinking wine and planning the impossible. Savannah had found sketch pads and was drawing her vision for the gallery renovation, while Camila made lists of everything we'd need to research. I sat in front of Margaret's easel, staring at the unfinished painting and trying to imagine what it would feel like to pick up a brush again after so many years. You know, Savannah said, looking up from her sketches, there's something I need to tell you. About Dad and the divorce and everything. Something in her tone made both Camila and me stop what we were doing. What is it? I asked. I'm glad, she said simply. I know that probably makes me a terrible daughter, but I'm glad he's gone. I'm glad you don't have to keep pretending that his dreams are more important than yours. I'm glad I get to see what you're like when you're not trying to make yourself smaller for someone else. The honesty in her voice broke something open in my chest. Here was my 17-year-old daughter, wise beyond her years, seeing truths I'd been too scared to acknowledge. You're not terrible, I said. You're brave, braver than I've been. You're being brave now, she said. You're finally being brave. As if summoned by the acknowledgement of my newfound courage, my phone buzzed with a text from Brian. We need to talk soon about practical matters. I'm hoping we can finalize things quickly and amicably. I stared at the message, feeling the familiar tug of old patterns, the impulse to respond immediately, to accommodate his timeline, to make things easier for him even when they were harder for me. Instead, I turned the phone face down and picked up one of Margaret's brushes. What are you doing? Camila asked. Something I should have done years ago, I said, studying the unfinished painting with new eyes. I'm going to finish what she started. The first brush stroke felt foreign, clumsy, like speaking a language I'd once been fluent in but hadn't used in decades. But the second stroke felt more natural, and the third felt like coming home. As I worked, adding color to the spaces Margot had left waiting, I felt something shift inside me. The careful, controlled woman who'd spent 12 years managing Brian's needs and expectations was dissolving, replaced by someone I'd almost forgotten existed. Someone who believed in beauty, who wasn't afraid to make mistakes, who understood that creating something was an act of faith in the future. Mom, Savannah said softly, watching me work, you look different when you paint. How do I look? Like yourself, she said, like the person you were always supposed to be. Outside, Chicago was settling into evening, the city lights beginning To twinkle like stars fallen to earth. Inside Margit's house, my house now, we were planning an impossible dream and bringing a painting back to life. 3 women connected by love and loss and the radical belief that it was never too late to start over. When I finally set down the brush, hours later, the painting was transformed. Not finished, it would take many more sessions to complete what Margot had begun, but alive in a way it hadn't been before. He landscape she'd created now had a figure walking through it. A woman moving towards something just outside the frame. Her back straight and her step confident. "It's beautiful," Camila said, and I could hear the tears in her voice. "It's a beginning," I corrected, stepping back to see the work with fresh eyes. That night, as we locked up the townhouse and prepared to return to our temporary lives, I felt the weight of possibility settling around me like a cloak. The gallery, the house, the painting. The future I was finally free to choose. All of it was waiting for me to be brave enough to claim it. Brian could text and call and demand responses to his timeline, but I had work to do, a life to rebuild, and dreams to resurrect. He was going to have to wait his turn, because for the first time in my adult life, I had more important things to think about than making someone else comfortable with my choices. As we walked toward the train station, Savannah slipped her hand into mine. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For showing me what it looks like when a woman decides to save herself." I squeezed her hand, thinking about Margot and the legacy she'd left us. About the courage it took to unfold after years of making yourself small. About the radical act of choosing joy over safety. "Thank you for reminding me that I was worth saving," I said. Behind us, the lights of Margit's house, our house, glowed warm against the October darkness. And ahead of us stretched a future that was finally, completely ours to paint. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on a Saturday, jolting me awake in the guest bedroom of Margit's townhouse, where I'd been spending more and more nights. I'd been dreaming about colors, deep blues and warm golds flowing together on canvas, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or why my phone was ringing so insistently. Brian's name flashed on the screen, and something cold settled in my stomach. He never called this early unless there was a crisis, and given how our coffee meeting had ended 3 days ago, his definition of crisis was probably evolving in real time. "Hello," I answered, my voice still thick with sleep. "Natalie, thank God, I've been trying to reach you." His voice had an edge I'd rarely heard before, not the controlled panic of his usual business emergencies, but something more desperate. "We need to talk today. It's important." I sat up in bed, instantly more awake, through the windows of Margit's bedroom. I could see the early morning light filtering through the oak trees that lined the quiet street. Everything about this place spoke to peace and possibility, and Brian's urgency felt like an invasion. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I can't discuss it over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere, please?" "Natalie, it's about our future." Savannah's future. The manipulation was so familiar it almost made me laugh. Invoke Savannah's welfare when he needed something. Make his problems into family problems that required my immediate attention and emotional labor to solve. "Brian, if there's something wrong with Savannah, she's fine," he said quickly. "This is about other things, financial things, things that affect all of us." There it was. The confirmation of what I'd suspected since our coffee meeting. His company was in serious trouble, and he was looking for solutions that might involve the resources he assumed I didn't have. "I'm actually quite busy today," I said, surprised by how easy the lie came. "I have commitments." It wasn't entirely untrue. Savannah and I had planned to spend the day at the gallery, meeting with the contractor who'd given us estimates for the renovation work we wanted to do. We were going to start transforming the space into something that honored Margit's vision while serving the community in ways that would have made her proud. "Commitments?" Brian's voice sharpened with confusion. "What kind of commitments?" The question revealed everything about how he saw me, as someone whose time was infinitely flexible, whose priorities should automatically rearrange themselves around his needs. The idea that I might have plans, projects, a life that didn't revolve around his convenience was apparently incomprehensible. "Personal ones," I said simply. "Perhaps we could talk tomorrow?" Tomorrow might be too late. The desperation in his voice was becoming more obvious with each exchange. "Natalie, please, I know things have been difficult between us, but we need to discuss some opportunities that have come up." Opportunities, as if whatever crisis he was facing could be reframed as a chance for mutual benefit. It was classic Brian, never admit weakness, never ask for help directly, always find a way to make his problems sound like everybody's problems. What kind of opportunities? I asked, though I was fairly certain I already knew where this was heading: investment opportunities, partnership possibilities, things that could benefit both of us. And Savannah too. He paused, and I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach. Look, I know I handled things poorly when I left. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry about that, but that doesn't mean we can't still be partners in some ways. For Savannah's sake, if nothing else, the apology was new, and it would have meant everything to me a month ago. Now it felt calculated, strategic, the kind of thing he'd say if he needed something from me badly enough to swallow his pride. Brian, I said carefully, what exactly is going on with your company? The silence that followed was answer enough when he finally spoke. His voice had dropped to something closer to honesty than I'd heard from him in years. We're facing some challenges: market volatility, investor confidence issues, nothing insurmountable, but we need to move quickly to shore up our position. Another pause. I was hoping you might know someone who could help, someone with capital to invest in a proven business model. There it was, the real reason for his sudden desire to reconcile. His concern for our future, his willingness to apologize for the pain he'd caused. Brian Quinn, who'd built his reputation on reading markets and identifying opportunities, had apparently decided that his estranged wife might be sitting on resources he could access. The irony was staggering. He was absolutely right. I did know someone with capital to invest, but that someone was me. And the proven business model I was interested in supporting had nothing to do with his failing startup, and everything to do with the gallery that was going to honor Margaret's Emery while giving emerging artists a platform. I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties, I said, and meant it. Whatever else Brian was, he wasn't a bad person, just a selfish one. But I don't think I can help you with that. You haven't even heard the details yet. This could be a real opportunity for you too, Natalie. A chance to be part of something bigger than. He stopped himself before finishing that sentence. But I could hear what he'd been about to say. Bigger than the small life he'd always assumed was all I was capable of wanting. Then what, Brian? I just meant, look, I know you've been feeling lost since I left, uncertain about your future. This could give you purpose, direction, a way to be involved in something meaningful. The condescension was breathtaking. Here I was, sitting in a house I owned outright, planning to open an arts center that would serve hundreds of people. Finally pursuing dreams I'd abandoned to support his ambitions, and he was offering to give my life meaning through proximity to his failing business. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'm not feeling lost at all, quite the opposite. Actually, what does that mean? I looked around Margaret's bedroom, my bedroom, at the morning lights streaming through windows that overlooked a garden I was learning to tend, at the easel I'd set up in the corner, where I'd been working on my own paintings for the first time in decades. It means I'm exactly where I need to be, I said. Natalie. His voice took on the tone he used when he was trying to close a difficult deal, equal parts charm and urgency. I think we should meet in person to discuss this. There are things I need to explain, opportunities that might not be available much longer. I'm sure there are, I said. But as I mentioned, I'm busy today. Perhaps we could schedule something for next week. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, there was something new in his voice, a hardness that I'd rarely heard directed at me. Fine, he said, but don't wait too long to call me back. Natalie, some opportunities don't come around twice. After he hung up, I lay in bed for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about Brian's current situation. His company was failing, that much was clear. But more than that, he was panicking in a way I'd never seen before. Brian had always been supremely confident in his ability to charm and negotiate his way out of problems. The desperation in his voice suggested that his usual tactics weren't working anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Camila. Coffee before the gallery meeting? I have news about your husband's company. Interesting. I texted back, yes, bring everything you found. An hour later, I met Camila at a cafe in Lincoln Park, not far from the townhouse. She was already seated when I arrived, her laptop open and a thick folder of papers spread across the table. You look different, she said as I sat down, rested. Happy. I'm sleeping better, I admitted. Margaret's house is peaceful in a way our apartment never was. Speaking of peaceful, Wait until you hear what I found out about Brian's startup. Camila turned her laptop screen toward me. Remember how you said he seemed desperate when he called this morning? Well, there's a good reason for that. The screen showed a business news article with the headline, Techflow Solutions Faces Investigation, Overinflated Valuations. Below it was a photo of Brian looking harried as he left what appeared to be a government building. Investigation. I leaned forward to read the article. For what? SEC inquiry into whether they've been misrepresenting their revenue and user growth to investors. Apparently, someone leaked internal documents showing that their claimed metrics were creative. Camila scrolled down to show charts and graphs that meant nothing to me but clearly spelled disaster for Brian's company. How bad is it? Bad enough that 3 major investors have pulled out in the last week. Bad enough that they're facing potential fraud charges if the investigation finds what the leaked documents suggest it will find. She pulled out several printed articles from her folder. But here's the really interesting part. Guess who's been posting cryptic messages about toxic masculine business culture and men who use women as stepping stones on her Instagram? I didn't need to guess. Tara Wallace, fitness influencer and Brian's supposed soulmate, has been dropping hints about her relationship status that suggest all is not well in paradise. Camila showed me screenshots of Instagram posts that were carefully worded but unmistakably pointed. She posted this yesterday. Learning that success built on lies is just expensive failure, grateful for the lesson but ready for authenticity. The posts were clearly about Brian, though Tara was smart enough not to mention him by name. But the implications were obvious. Their relationship was fracturing under the pressure of his business problems. And she was already positioning herself as the wronged party who'd been deceived about his financial stability. So let me get this straight, I said slowly. Brian's company is under federal investigation. His investors are fleeing. His girlfriend is publicly distancing herself from him. And this morning he called me looking for investment opportunities. That about sums it up. Camila closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The question is, what are you going to do with this information? It was a good question. The old Natalie would have felt sympathy for Brian's predicament, would have worried about how this would affect Savannah, would have looked for ways to help even though he'd abandoned our marriage for a woman who was now abandoning him in turn. But the new Natalie, the woman who'd been sleeping peacefully in Margaret's house and spending her mornings painting and her afternoons planning a gallery that would outlast any startup, felt something closer to detached curiosity. Brian's problems were no longer automatically my problems to solve. I'm going to do exactly what I've been doing, I said. I'm going to focus on my own life and let him handle his. Even if he keeps calling, keeps pushing for meetings. I thought about the desperation in his voice that morning, the way he'd tried to frame his crisis as our opportunity. The assumption that I would drop everything to help him navigate problems he'd created for himself. Especially then, I said. Margot left me a lot of things, but guilt wasn't one of them. We walked to the gallery together, and I felt the familiar thrill of possibility as we approached the space that was slowly becoming the physical manifestation of everything I'd rediscovered about mice. LF, the contractor, was already waiting when we arrived, along with Savannah, who'd brought her portfolio of renovation ideas. For the next 3 hours, we talked about lighting and wall placement, about creating spaces that would showcase art while also serving as classrooms and community meeting areas. I found myself making decisions with a confidence that surprised me, not because I was certain about every choice, but because I was finally invested in creating something that mattered to me. My phone buzzed several times during the meeting. Texts from Brian that grew increasingly urgent as I continued to ignore them. Natalie, please call me. This is time sensitive. I need to speak with you today. Don't make me come find you. This affects Savannah too. Don't be selfish. The last message made me laugh out loud, earning curious looks from the contractor and Savannah. Dad, Savannah asked, having recognized the pattern of my phone checking and subsequent eye rolling. Your father is having some business difficulties, and seems to think I should drop everything to help him solve them, I said. Are you going to? I looked around the gallery space, at the walls that would soon display work by artists who might never have had a platform otherwise. At my daughter, who was sketching ideas for a community art program with the kind of passion I'd forgotten I was capable of feeling. No, I said. I'm not. Good, Savannah said firmly. You have more important things to do. She was right. I did have more important things to do, and for the first time in my marriage, Brian's crisis was going to have to wait its turn. As we locked up the gallery that evening, I felt the satisfaction of a day well spent in service of my own dreams rather than someone else's emergencies. My phone showed 7 missed calls from Brian and a string of texts that grew more desperate with each message. But I had paintings to finish, a gallery to open, and a life to build that had nothing to do with being anyone's rescue plan. Brian would figure out his problems the same way I'd figured out mine, by taking responsibility for his choices and building something better from the ground up. The difference was, I had Margot's inheritance and her belief in my worth to help me rebuild. Brian only had his wounded pride and his diminishing ability to charm his way out of consequences. For the first time since he'd announced he was leaving me for a younger woman, I actually felt sorry for him. Not sorry enough to save him, but sorry enough to hope he'd figure out how to save himself, because I was finally done being anyone's backup plan, even my own. Jonathan Lynn's expression grew more serious as he read through the documents I'd brought him, printouts of the news articles Camila had found, screenshots of Brian's increasingly frantic text messages, and a detailed timeline of his attempts to contact me over the past week. He's escalating, Jonathan said, setting down the papers and removing his glasses to clean them with deliberate precision. And men in financial crisis don't always make rational decisions about what belongs to them. We were meeting in his office on a Tuesday morning. The city spread out below us in the crisp November light. I'd called him the day before after Brian had shown up at the gallery unannounced, demanding to speak with me, and making such a scene that Savannah had threatened to call security. The mask of charming entrepreneur was slipping, revealing someone I was beginning not to recognize. What exactly are you recommending? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. We need to accelerate your legal protections. The LLC structures we set up are solid, but given what you've told me about his behavior, I want to add additional layers. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. First, we're going to update your will and establish clear inheritance protections for Savannah. Second, we're going to create a more sophisticated trust structure that will make it impossible for anyone to claim your assets or marital property, even though we're not officially divorced yet. Especially because you're not officially divorced. Yet Jonathan's voice was grim. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, which means that in theory, courts can divide marital property in a way that seems fair, but that doesn't necessarily mean equal. The inheritance itself is protected as separate property since you received it after separation. But if Brian can demonstrate that marital funds were commingled with the inheritance, or if he can prove the inheritance was used for marital purposes, he didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood the implication. Brian was smart enough to look for angles, to find ways to claim that my newfound independence was somehow built on resources that rightfully belonged to both of us. There's something else, I said, pulling out the folder of documents David Chen had given me when I'd called him yesterday. Margot apparently anticipated this possibility. Jonathan took the folder and began reading, his eyebrows rising with each page. Your aunt was remarkably thorough, he said finally. She's documented her intention to leave these assets specifically to you as separate property, included affidavits about your estrangement from Brian, and even provided character references attesting to your independent relationship with her. Prior to your marriage, she thought of everything because she'd seen this pattern before. He handed me a letter I hadn't noticed in the folder, one addressed to me in Margot's familiar handwriting. This was included with instructions to give it to you if your inheritance was ever legally challenged. Ged, I opened it with shaking hands, already knowing that Margot had somehow anticipated exactly this situation. My darling Natalie, if you're reading this letter, it means that someone is trying to claim ownership of what I've left you. I'm not surprised. Vultures always circle when they smell opportunity. And Brian always struck me as someone who believed other people's good fortune was somehow his by right. I want you to know that every dollar, every painting, every brick of the townhouse was acquired with my money, my decisions, my vision of what you might become if you were ever given the space to grow. Not one penny came from your marriage. Not one choice was influenced by Brian's presence in your life. More importantly, I want you to remember that your worth isn't measured by what you own. The inheritance is a tool, not a definition. You would be extraordinary with or without it. But I wanted you to have choices, real choices, not the kind where all the options have already been decided by someone else's needs. Don't let anyone take that from you. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve freedom, or that asking for what you want is somehow selfish. The world is full of people who will try to make you smaller to make themselves feel bigger. Your job is to refuse that diminishment. Fight for yourself, my darling girl. Fight as hard for your own happiness as you've fought for everyone else's. All my love and faith in you. Margotty read the letter twice before looking up to find Jonathan watching me with something that looked like admiration. She really loved you, he said quietly. She loved the person she thought I could become. I corrected. I'm just trying to prove she was right from what I've seen over the past few weeks. I'd say she was very right. He returned to his legal pad, making more notes. Now, let's talk about the practical steps. We're going to file an amended trust document that explicitly states your separate property rights. We're going to add Savannah as a beneficiary with her own protected interests. And we're going to create a power of attorney structure that gives you complete control over any decisions regarding the inheritance over the next hour. Jonathan walked me through a maze of legal protections that would have been incomprehensible to me a month ago: trust amendments, asset protection strategies, confidentiality agreements that would prevent anyone from gaining access to information about my finances without my explicit consent. There's one more thing, he said as we neared the end of our meeting. I want to recommend that you document any interactions with Brian going forward. Keep records of his requests for money, his attempts to involve you in his business problems, anything that might establish a pattern of harassment or manipulation. You think it might come to that? I think a man who's facing federal investigation and potential bankruptcy might be capable of things that would have seemed impossible when he was successful and confident. Jonathan's expression was serious. Desperation makes people unpredictable, Natalie, and Brian has already demonstrated that he's willing to blow up your life when it serves his purposes. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Brian's name flashed on the screen, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that his calls had been producing for weeks. Answer it, Jonathan said, but put it on speaker. I want to hear what he says. I accepted the call with shaking hands. Hello, Brian. Natalie, finally. I've been trying to reach you for days. His voice had an edge of hysteria that I'd never heard before. We need to meet today. There are urgent matters that can't wait any longer. What kind of urgent matters? Financial matters, legal matters, things that affect both of us and Savannah. He paused, and I could hear him trying to modulate his tone into something more reasonable. Look, I know you're angry with me about how things ended. I know I handled it poorly, but we're still family, Natalie. We're still connected, financially and legally, and I need you to understand what that means. Jonathan was taking notes, his expression growing more concerned with each word. Brian, I don't understand what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to be realistic about our situation, about the fact that my problems are your problems too, about the fact that if my company goes under, it affects Savannah's future, your financial security, everything we've built together. The manipulation was so blatant it took my breath away. Brian's company failing would have exactly zero impact on my financial security, and he had to know that. But he was betting that I didn't know that I was still the woman who'd spent 12 years believing his success was the foundation of our family stability. What specifically are you asking me to do? I repeated. I need you to consider making an investment, a substantial investment, in the company, in our future, in Savannah's security. His words came faster now, as if he was afraid I'd hang up before he could finish his pitch. This is a temporary situation, Natalie. The investigation will clear us. The investors will come back. But I need bridge funding to keep us afloat until that happens. How substantial? $2 million, maybe 3. I know it sounds like a lot, but I hung up for a moment. Jonathan and I sat in silence, processing what we'd just heard. Brian hadn't just been fishing for financial help, he'd been operating under the assumption that I had millions of dollars available to invest in his failing company. He knows, Jonathan said finally. How could he know? We've been so careful. He's probably had you investigated, hired a private detective, maybe, or just done some digging on his own. He's seen you spending money you shouldn't have, moving into properties you couldn't afford on a paralegal's salary. Jonathan's expression was grim. The question is, how much does he know? And what is he planning to do with that information? My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. don't hang up on me again. Natalie, we need to finish this conversation. I'm coming over. I stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. He's coming to the townhouse. No, Jonathan said firmly. You're not going home right now. We're going to call your divorce attorney and accelerate the legal separation proceedings. We're going to file for a restraining order if necessary. And we're going to make sure that Brian understands that harassment won't get him what he wants, as if reading my mind, he continued, and tomorrow, we're going to have Savannah's trust documents finalized and filed, whatever happens between you and Brian. Your daughter's future needs to be protected. I thought about Savannah, probably at school right now, unaware that her father was circling like a predator around resources he'd never been entitled to. The inheritance was supposed to give us choices, freedom, the ability to build lives that weren't constrained by other people's limitations. Instead, it was becoming the thing that made us targets. Jonathan, I said quietly, do you think I made a mistake, accepting the inheritance? I mean, would we be safer if I just turned it down? He was quiet for a long moment, considering. His words, Natalie, I've been managing wealthy people's money for 15 years. I've seen what money can do to families, how it can bring out the worst in people who seemed decent before they smelled opportunity. He paused, then continued. But I've also seen what happens to women who don't have their own resources, who depend on other people's generosity, other people's choices, other people's definitions of what they deserve. Your aunt didn't leave you this inheritance to make your life easier. She left it to make your life yours, even if it means dealing with Brian's threats. Especially if it means dealing with Brian's threats. Because now you have the resources to protect yourself. To hire lawyers to make choices based on what you want rather than what you can afford. His voice was firm. Brian is desperate right now, which makes him dangerous, but he's also revealed his true character, which makes him predictable. We can work with predictable. My phone rang again. This time it was Savannah, calling from school. Mom, Dad just showed up at school asking to take me to lunch. He seems weird, really intense. Should I go with him? The ice in my stomach spread outward. Brian was escalating faster than even Jonathan had predicted, and now he was involving Savannah in whatever scheme he was developing. No, I said firmly, tell the office that you're not authorized to leave with him today. I'll be there in 20 minutes to pick you up. Is everything okay? Everything is fine, I lied. Already gathering my things. I'll explain when I see you. After I hung up, Jonathan was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling your divorce attorney now. This has moved beyond financial protection into physical safety territory. As I rushed toward the elevator, my phone buzzed with another text from Brian. You can run from this conversation, but you can't avoid it forever. We're going to discuss this today. One way or another, for the first time since Margaret's inheritance had changed my life, I felt truly afraid. Not of losing the money. I was beginning to understand that the money was just a tool, a means to an end that I was capable of reaching with or without it. I was afraid of what Brian might be willing to do to someone he'd once claimed to love, now that he saw her not as a partner but as an obstacle to his survival. But as the elevator descended toward the lobby, I also felt something else rising in my chest. Anger, pure, clean anger at a man who'd abandoned his family when he thought he had better options, and who now wanted to claim ownership of resources he'd never contributed to, never earned, never deserved. Margot had told me to fight for myself as hard as I'd fought for everyone else. It was time to find out what that looked like when the stakes were this high and the opponent was someone who thought he knew exactly how small I was willing to make myself to avoid conflict. He was about to learn that the woman he'd married no longer existed. In her place was someone who had choices, resources, and the absolute determination to protect what was hers. Brian wanted a fight. He was about to get one. The notification popped up on my phone while I was reviewing gallery contracts at Margaret's kitchen table. Savannah safely beside me working on college application essays. The Chicago Business Journal had tagged me in an article with the headline, Techflow CEO's personal life implodes as company faces federal scrutiny. I stared at the notification for a long moment, my coffee growing cold in my hands. It had been 3 days since Brian's appearance at Savannah's school. 3 days since Jonathan had filed the restraining order. 3 days of careful normalcy, while Brian's world collapsed in increasingly public ways. Now, apparently, the media had found an angle that involved me. Mom, Savannah looked up from her laptop, You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, I said, showing her the notification. More like a train wreck, she read the headline. Anne winced. Do you want to read it together? The article was worse than I'd expected. Not because it was inaccurate everything and it was technically true, but because it painted a picture of Brian's life falling apart in real time. With Tara Wallace providing increasingly detailed commentary to anyone with a microphone, TouchFlow Solutions CEO Brian Quinn, already facing federal investigation into potentially fraudulent business practices, is now dealing with a very public breakup that has exposed additional questions about his character and judgment. Fitness influencer Tara Wallace, who had been in a relationship with Quinn since his separation from his wife earlier this year, has been posting detailed accounts of what she describes as financial manipulation and emotional gaslighting in a series of Instagram posts and TikTok videos that have gone viral. Wallace claims that Quinn misrepresented his financial situation to her, used her social media presence to bolster investor confidence in his company, and attempted to involve her in what she describes as increasingly desperate schemes to raise money from anyone willing to listen. The article included screenshots of Tara's posts, each one more damning than the last. She'd apparently documented everything: text messages where Brian asked her to post about exciting business developments at specific times, recordings of phone calls where he coached her on what to say to her wealthy followers about investment opportunities, evidence of him using her apartment and social connections to host impromptu fundraising events. But it was her latest post that made my stomach clench. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. My ex tried to tell me his wife was just being vindictive about money. But now I'm wondering what else he lied about. To any woman who thinks she can change a man who treats his family like collateral damage, you can't. You're just next in line. She's really going for it, Savannah said, reading over my shoulder. I almost feel sorry for Dad, almost. He chose her because she had a platform and he thought he could use it. Now she's using it against him. Savannah shrugged with the casual wisdom of 17, play with fire, get burned. The article continued with quotes from unnamed sources at TouchFlow, describing an increasingly chaotic work environment as Brian became more erratic and demanding. 3 more investors had pulled out in the past week, and there were rumors that the SEC investigation was expanding to include potential tax fraud. But it was the final paragraph that made me set down my phone with shaking hands. Sources close to the situation report that Quinn has been pressuring his estranged wife, paralegal Natalie Quinn, to provide financial support for his legal defense and business operations. Mrs. Quinn, who has been notably absent from public discussions of her husband's difficulties, declined to comment for this article. Friends describe her as focused on rebuilding her life and protecting her daughter during this difficult period. Someone had been talking to reporters. Someone who knew enough about Brian's recent behavior to describe it accurately, but who also seemed protective of my privacy. I suspected Camila, though she'd never admit it. My phone rang before I could process the implications fully. It was David Chen. Natalie, I assume you've seen the article. Just finished reading it. David, I never spoke to any reporters. I know you didn't. But Brian's behavior has been public enough that journalists were bound to pick up the story. Eventually, his voice was calm but concerned. I'm calling because there's something else you need to know. Brian's attorney contacted me this morning. Something cold settled in my stomach. About what? He's claiming that Margot's inheritance should be considered marital property because it was given to you while you were still legally married. He's also claiming that your recent expenditures on the gallery renovation constitute misuse of marital assets. I felt Savannah's hand slip into mine under the table, her college essays forgotten as she listened to the conversation that would determine both our futures. Can he do that? I mean, legally, he can try. The timing of the inheritance and your separation makes it complicated, but Margot's documentation should protect you. The bigger concern is what this tells us about his mental state. David paused. Natalie, desperate people make desperate choices. Brian's world is collapsing very publicly, and he's looking for someone to blame right now. That someone appears to be you. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think hiding behind lawyers will protect you? This isn't over, Natalie. You owe me more than you're willing to admit. I showed the message to Savannah, who immediately took a screenshot. Documentation, she said grimly. Mr. Lynn said to keep records of everything. David was still talking, explaining legal strategies and protection measures, but I was only half listening, because underneath the fear and anger and frustration, I was discovering something that surprised me. I wasn't collapsing under the pressure. The woman who would have crumbled at the first sign of conflict, who would have found ways to accommodate Brian's demands to avoid public embarrassment, was nowhere to be found. In her place was someone who'd learned that her worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval. Someone who'd spent weeks making choices based on her own values rather than someone else's expectations. Someone who'd inherited more than money from Margot. She'd inherited the radical belief that she deserved to take up space in her own life. David, I interrupted. What would happen if we went public with our side of the story? What do you mean? I mean, what if I stopped hiding from this? What if I did an interview? Told people about Margot's inheritance and Brian's harassment and what this whole situation really looks like from my perspective. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Natalie, he said finally, that would be unprecedented. Divorce proceedings usually benefit from privacy, not publicity. But we're not talking about a usual divorce, are we? We're talking about a man who's using public pressure and legal intimidation to try to steal money that never belonged to him. I looked around Margot's kitchen, at the life I'd built in the space she'd given me, at my daughter who was watching me make the choice between safety and truth. Maybe it's time people knew what that looked like. Savannah squeezed my hand. I think Aunt Margot would approve. She was right. Margot had never backed down from a fight, never apologized for taking up space, never let anyone convince her that asking for what she deserved was somehow selfish. She'd lived her entire life as a woman who refused to be diminished by other people's expectations. Let me think about it, I told David, but in the meantime, I want you to file a response to Brian's claims that makes our position very clear. Margot's inheritance is separate property, documented and protected. Any attempt to claim otherwise is harassment, and we have evidence of his intimidation tactics. After I hung up, Savannah and I sat in the kitchen's golden afternoon light, both of us processing the reality that our private struggle was becoming increasingly public whether we chose it or not. Mom, Savannah said finally, what are you going to do? I thought about Margot's letter, about her directive to fight as hard for my own happiness as I'd fought for everyone else's. I thought about the gallery, about the community of artists we were building, about the life I was creating that had nothing to do with being anyone's victim or anyone's villain. I'm going to tell the truth, I said, and then I'm going to get back to work. My phone rang again this time. It was a number I didn't recognize with a Chicago area code. Mrs. Quinn. This is Sarah Martinez from Channel 7 News. I'm working on a follow-up story about your husband's business difficulties, and I was hoping to get your perspective on some recent developments. I looked at Savannah, who nodded encouragingly. Actually, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice, I think that would be a very good idea. When would you like to meet? That evening, I called Camila and Jonathan for an emergency strategy session. We gathered in Margot's living room, surrounded by her paintings and her books and the accumulated evidence of a life lived on her own terms. Are you sure about this? Jonathan asked after I'd explained my decision to do the interview. Once you go public, there's no taking it back, I'm sure, I said. Brian has been controlling the narrative by making this about his business problems and positioning me as either an obstacle or a resource. It's time people understood that this is actually about a woman who inherited money from her aunt. And a man who thinks that gives him the right to harass her for it. What are you going to say about the inheritance? Camila asked. The truth, that Margot left me money because she loved me and wanted me to have choices. That every penny was earned and saved by her, with no contribution from Brian, that I'm using it to build something meaningful rather than to rescue someone who abandoned his family for a younger woman and then came crawling back when his life fell apart. Savannah, who'd been quietly listening from the corner where she was sketching, looked up with pride in her eyes. Aunt Margot would be so proud of you right now. I hope so, I said. Because I'm about to find out what happens when a woman stops apologizing for having what she deserves and starts insisting on keeping it. The interview was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. By tomorrow night, everyone in Chicago would know exactly who Natalie Quinn really was. Not Brian's victim, not his resource, but a woman who'd inherited both money and the wisdom to use it on her own terms. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I was looking forward to the conversation, because I finally had a story worth telling. And it had nothing to do with being anyone's second choice and everything to do with choosing myself first. The train wreck of Brian's life could continue without my participation. I had better things to do than watch someone who'd thrown away his family discover what it felt like to lose everything else too. The news interview had aired at 6 o'clock that evening, and by 8:30, my phone was buzzing with messages of support from people I hadn't heard from in years. The story that Channel 7 had broadcast was nothing like the narrative Brian had been trying to control instead of a bitter ex-wife standing in the way of her former husband's recovery. They'd presented a woman who'd inherited money from a beloved aunt and was using it to create something meaningful while fending off harassment from a man whose business was collapsing under federal investigation. I'd been honest but measured, explaining Margit's bequest without revealing specific amounts, describing Brian's pressure tactics without seeming vindictive, and focusing on the gallery project and what it meant to honor my aunt's memory. The reporter had been fair, even sympathetic, and the piece had painted a clear picture of who was the victim and who was the predator in this situation. Now, as I sat in Margit's living room with Savannah, reviewing the supportive messages and trying to process how dramatically my life had changed in just a few hours, I heard the sound that I'd been both dreading and expecting, someone pounding on the front door with the kind of urgency that suggested they weren't going away quietly. Savannah looked up from her laptop, where she'd been monitoring social media responses to the interview. "Should I call the police?" "Not yet," I said, though my hand moved instinctively toward my phone. "But be ready." The pounding continued, accompanied now by Brian's voice calling my name with an edge of hysteria that I'd never heard before. "Natalie, I know you're in there. We need to talk. You can't hide from this forever." I moved to the window and peered through the curtains. Brian was standing on the front porch, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that spoke to how far he'd fallen in just a few weeks. His hair was unkempt. His clothes looked like he'd slept in them, and there was something wild in his eyes that made my chest tighten with genuine fear. "He looks," Savannah started, then trailed off, "desperate," I finished, "which makes him dangerous." The pounding stopped, and for a moment I thought he might have given up. Then I heard him moving around the side of the house, and I realized he was trying to find another way in. "Natalie." His voice was coming from the back garden now. I saw the interview. "You think you can destroy me with lies and manipulation? You think you can steal what's rightfully mine and then play the victim on television?" I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But before I could speak to the dispatcher, Brian appeared at the back door, his face pressed against the glass like something out of a horror movie. "We're going to settle this right now," he shouted, trying the door handle and finding it locked. "You owe me, Natalie. You owe me for everything I gave you, everything I sacrificed for this family." 911, "What's your emergency?" "This is Natalie Quinn at 1247 North Cleveland Avenue. My estranged husband is trying to break into my house. He's violated a restraining order and he's not stable right now, ma'am. We're dispatching units to your location. Are you and any other occupants safe where you are for now?" "Yes. My daughter is with me. We're locked inside, but he's trying to get in through the back door." As I spoke to the dispatcher, I could hear Brian's voice becoming more unhinged, his demands shifting from pleas to threats to something that sounded like complete dissociation from reality. "You think Margit's money makes you better than me? You think having millions of dollars means you can just throw away 12 years of marriage like it meant nothing?" His voice was getting hoarse from shouting. "I made you who you are, Natalie. Without me, you'd still be some nobody paralegal dreaming about a life you could never afford." Savannah had moved to stand beside me, her face pale but her expression determined. "Mom, he's completely lost it." She was right. This wasn't the controlled, manipulative Brian I'd lived with for 12 years. This was a man whose carefully constructed identity had collapsed so completely that he was no longer capable of maintaining the facade of reasonableness that had always been his most effective tool. "I know about the inheritance," he screamed, his voice cracking. $5 million. $5 million that should be half mine. We're still married, Natalie. We're still legally married. And that means what's yours is mine." I almost laughed at the bitter irony. For 12 years, what was mine had been his, my dreams, my ambitions. My identity had all been subsumed into his vision of what our life should look like, but the moment I had something that was truly my own, something that gave me choices and independence, Suddenly the principle of shared ownership became important to him. Ma'am? The dispatcher's voice brought me back to the immediate situation. The officers are about 2 minutes away. Can you tell me what he's doing now? I looked toward the back door, where Brian had stopped trying the handle and was now just standing there, his hands pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the window. He stopped shouting, I said. He's just standing there. For a moment, the house was eerily quiet. Then Brian's voice came again, but different this time, softer, more broken than angry. Natalie, please, just talk to me. Just give me 5 minutes to explain what's happening, what I need, why this is so important. His voice was almost pleading now. I know I handled things badly with Tara. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this, we can work together. You have resources now, I have experience and connections. We could be partners again. The whiplash from rage to manipulation was so classic Brian that I almost felt sorry for him, almost. This was his pattern: escalate until intimidation failed, then shift to charm and negotiation, always operating under the assumption that everyone around him existed primarily to solve his problems. Mom, Savannah said quietly, he still doesn't get it. Does he? He still thinks this is about him. She was right, even in his desperation, even facing the complete collapse of everything he'd built. Brian couldn't conceive of a world where other people's choices weren't primarily about their relationship. To him, he couldn't imagine that I'd rebuild my life not in reaction to his abandonment, but in pursuit of dreams I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. The sound of sirens approaching seemed to snap him back to reality. I watched through the window as his expression shifted from pleading to panic to something that looked like genuine confusion. Natalie, his voice was sharp again. You called the police on me. I'm trying to have a conversation with my wife, ex-wife, I said loudly enough for him to hear through the glass. I filed the papers yesterday, Brian. We're done. The look on his face when he heard those words was something I'd remember for the rest of my life. Not anger this time, but complete bewilderment. As if the idea that I might take action without his permission or input was genuinely incomprehensible to him. The police arrived with lights flashing, and I watched through the front windows as 2 officers approached the house, while a third went around back to where Brian was still standing at the door like a lost child. What followed was almost anticlimactic. Brian didn't resist arrest. He seemed to deflate completely once he realized that charm and manipulation weren't going to work on the officers. I gave my statement while Savannah provided the screenshots and recordings we'd been collecting of his increasingly erratic behavior. The officers were professional and thorough, and it was clear that they'd dealt with this kind of domestic situation many times before. Mrs. Quinn, one of the officers, said as they prepared to leave with Brian in custody, given the restraining order violation and the pattern of harassment you've documented, the DA will probably want to press charges. Are you prepared for that process? I looked through the front window at Brian sitting in the back of the police car, his head in his hands, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen him a month ago. The sight would have filled me with pity, with the reflexive urge to fix his problems and manage his pain. Now I felt something closer to closure. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. After the police left, Savannah and I sat in the living room, both of us processing what had just happened. The house felt different now, not just safe again, but somehow lighter, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. Are you okay? I asked her. I think so, she said, then looked at me with an expression that was older than her 17 years. Are you? I considered the question seriously. Was I okay? My marriage was officially over. My ex-husband was in jail, and by tomorrow everyone in Chicago would know the details of my private life. 6 months ago, any one of those things would have felt like a catastrophe. But sitting in Margot's living room, surrounded by evidence of a life lived without apology, planning a gallery that would outlast any startup, raising a daughter who was learning what it looked like when a woman chose herself, I realized that I was more than okay. I'm free, I said, and felt the truth of it settle in my bones. Savannah smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since this whole ordeal began. Aunt Margot would be proud. I think she'd be satisfied, I corrected. This is what she was hoping for when she left me the inheritance. Not the money itself, but what I'd become when I finally had the resources to choose my own path. My phone buzzed with a text from Camila. Saw the news about Brian's arrest. Are you and Savannah safe? I texted back. We're perfect. Come over tomorrow. And we'll celebrate. Celebrate what? The beginning of everything. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was someone I was still getting to know, confident, purposeful, unafraid to take up space. She looked like someone who'd inherited more than money, who'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in the courage to live according to your own values. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of testifying against Brian if charges were filed. Tomorrow, I'd continue planning the gallery opening that would honor Margot's memory while serving the community she'd loved. Tomorrow, I'd keep building a life that had nothing to do with being anyone's supporting character and everything to do with being the author of my own story. But tonight, I was going to sleep peacefully in a house that belonged to me, in a life I'd chosen for myself, surrounded by the knowledge that I'd finally learned the most important lesson Margot had tried to teach me, that real love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller to make someone else feel bigger. Brian's story was ending in handcuffs and federal investigations and the kind of public humiliation he'd once thought only happened to other people. But my story was just beginning. And for the first time in my adult life, I couldn't wait to see what came next. The Meridian Gallery looked like something out of a dream on the night of our grand opening. Warm light spilled from the windows onto Wells Street, and through the glass, I could see the crowd of people who'd come to celebrate, not just art, but transformation, both mine and the artists whose work now graced walls that had once been empty and waiting. It had been for months since Brian's arrest, for months of legal proceedings and media attention and the slow, satisfying work of building something meaningful from the ground up. The gallery was no longer just Margot's vision or my inheritance. It had become a living testament to what happened when women were given space to grow into who they were meant to be. "Mom, you need to see this," Savannah called from across the room, where she was standing next to a piece that had drawn a small crowd. It was one of hers, a mixed media work that incorporated photography, painting, and found objects to explore themes of identity and transformation. The placard next to it read, "Savannah Quinn, age 17, Emerging Artist Scholarship recipient." I made my way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the community programs we developed. The scholarship fund that was already supporting 12 young artists, and the workshop series that had brought together women from across Chicago to explore creativity as a form of healing. "She's remarkable," said a woman I didn't recognize, studying Savannah's piece with obvious admiration. "The way she's captured the concept of metamorphosis, it's sophisticated beyond her years." "She had an excellent teacher," I said, thinking of Margot and all the ways her influence had shaped both of us, even from beyond the grave. As the evening progressed, I found myself moving through the space with a sense of profound satisfaction. This wasn't just an art opening, it was the physical manifestation of everything I'd learned about my own worth, about the importance of taking up space, about the radical act of choosing joy over safety. In one corner, Camila was deep in conversation with Jonathan Lynn about the financial literacy workshops we were planning to add to our programming. Near the back wall, 3 teenagers from the scholarship program were explaining their work to a group of collectors, their voices bright with confidence and possibility. And in the center of it all hung Margot's painting, the one I'd finished during those first weeks of transformation, showing a woman walking toward something just outside the frame. Tonight, surrounded by evidence of dreams made manifest, I finally understood what that something was. It wasn't a destination, it was the courage to keep walking toward whatever came next. "Natalie?" A woman approached me with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was on a mission. "I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Women's Leadership Institute." But mostly I thought about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that stretched ahead of me like a blank canvas waiting to be filled with whatever I chose to paint there. The inheritance had given me freedom, but I'd given myself something even more valuable: the knowledge that I was worth fighting for, that my dreams mattered, that taking up space in my own life wasn't a privilege to be earned but a right to be claimed. Brian's story had ended in legal consequences and public humiliation, exactly what happened when someone mistook other people for resources to be exploited rather than humans to be respected. Tara was beginning her own journey toward authenticity, learning to value substance over performance, and my story was just getting started. I pulled into the driveway of the house that Margot had left me, The house where I'd learn to paint again and dream again and believe that 42 wasn't too late to become the woman I'd always been meant to be. Tomorrow, I'd start writing the keynote speech that would help other women understand that they, too, could rebuild from the middle, could reclaim their voices, could refuse to accept smallness as the price of peace. Tonight, I was going to sit in Margaret's studio, my studio now, and work on the painting I'd been planning for weeks. A portrait of 3 women, Margot, Savannah, and me, standing together in front of a gallery filled with light, each of us taking up exactly as much space as we deserved. It was going to be beautiful. It was going to be bold. It was going to be unapologetically, gloriously mine, and that, I thought as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the life I'd chosen for myself, was exactly what Margot had been hoping for all along.